The scream tore through the storm, before Elena Voss even reached the tree line, and she froze, with her lantern shaking in her hand, the light throwing wild shadows across the mud. Something enormous had crashed through the underbrush, only moments ago, and the sound it left behind was not the scream of a man. It was lower, rougher, filled with a pain that made her chest tighten even from a distance. She had grown up in Draymore, a village pressed against the edge of the Ashwood forest, and every child there had been raised on warnings never to go near the trees after dark. Tonight, the warnings meant nothing to her, because somewhere in that darkness, something was dying, and she could not simply walk away and pretend she had heard nothing. The wind cut through her thin cloak as she pushed forward, rain slicing sideways and stinging her cheeks. Thunder rolled across the hills, so close it rattled the ground beneath her boots. She was not a brave woman by nature. She was a healer's apprentice, more comfortable with bandages and herbs than with storms and monsters. But 3 years of watching her mentor Agatha race toward the injured without hesitation had taught her one hard lesson. Fear was allowed, but it was never allowed to win. She found the creature collapsed in a shallow ravine, half hidden beneath a fallen log, its enormous body heaving with ragged breaths. In the flashes of lightning, she saw the shape of something between a wolf and a man, covered in dark fur that glistened with rain and blood. Its claws dug into the earth, as if it were trying to hold itself together. A long gash ran across its side, deep enough that she could see it was not going to survive the night without help. Every instinct told her to run. Every story she had ever heard about the beasts of Ashwood told her this was the moment she was supposed to turn and flee toward the village and never look back. Instead, she knelt at the edge of the ravine and spoke softly into the wind. Her voice trembled, but the words came steady. She told the creature she meant no harm, that she only wanted to help, that she had bandages in her satchel and steady hands that had stitched worse wounds than this. The creature's eyes opened, and for a moment she thought she was looking into the eyes of something ancient, something that had seen centuries pass and had grown tired of carrying whatever burden kept it alive. There was intelligence there, and something else too. Something close to disbelief, that anyone would kneel beside it instead of running. It did not attack her. It did not even flinch when she reached out with trembling fingers to press cloth against the wound. She worked quickly, murmuring the same calming words she used with frightened patients back home, ignoring the way her own heart pounded against her ribs. The creature's breathing slowed beneath her hands, not because the pain had lessened, but because something about her presence seemed to ease it. She had seen this before, in animals brought to her mentor's cottage. Sometimes creatures in pain simply needed to know they were not facing the end alone. The storm raged around them for what felt like hours. Elena lost track of everything except the rhythm of her own hands, the rise and fall of the creature's chest, and the strange calm that settled over her despite the danger. When the rain finally began to soften into a drizzle, she noticed the creature's massive form seemed to be shrinking, the fur receding, the shape shifting beneath her fingers into something unmistakably human. She pulled back sharply, gasping, as the transformation completed itself, leaving in the creature's place a man, broad-shouldered and pale, with dark hair plastered to his forehead, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He was unconscious, but very much a man now, lying in the mud where a beast had been only minutes before. For a long moment, Elena could not move. Her mind raced through everything she thought she understood about the world, and none of it explained what she had just witnessed. She thought of the old stories her grandmother used to tell, tales meant to frighten children into staying close to home after dark. Stories about a cursed bloodline in the Northern Kingdom, about a king who wore the shape of a monster because of a wrong done centuries ago. She had always believed those stories were exaggerations, the kind of thing villagers whispered to explain bad harvests and strange noises in the night. Now, kneeling beside an unconscious stranger who had been a beast only moments before, she was no longer certain of anything. She could not leave him there. Whatever he was, whoever he was, he needed shelter and warmth, or the night would finish what the wound had started. Summoning strength she did not know she had, she managed to drag him, inch by exhausting inch, toward the narrow cart path that led back to her cottage. It took nearly an hour, her arms burning, and her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she refused to stop. When she finally reached her small home at the edge of the village, she hauled him through the door and laid him by the hearth, stoking the fire until the room filled with warmth. She worked through what remained of the night, cleaning and stitching the wound properly, now that she had better light and steadier hands. The man never woke, though occasionally his brow furrowed, as if some distant pain still reached him, even in unconsciousness. Elena studied his face in the firelight, trying to place him among the traveling merchants and wandering strangers, who sometimes passed through Draymore, but she was certain she had never seen him before. There was something about his bearing, even unconscious, that suggested he was not an ordinary man. His clothes, torn and bloodied as they were, had been finely made, the kind of fabric she had only seen once before on a nobleman's carriage passing through the village square. Dawn arrived slowly, gray light creeping through the shutters, and Elena finally allowed herself to sit back and rest against the wall, exhaustion pulling at every muscle in her body. She must have drifted into a shallow sleep, because she woke with a start, to find the man's eyes open, watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He did not speak at first. He simply stared at her, as though trying to determine whether she was real, whether the events of the previous night had truly happened the way he remembered them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, carrying the weight of someone unaccustomed to being surprised by anything. He asked her how she was still alive. The question confused her, and she told him so, explaining that she had only tried to help him, that she meant him no harm. He sat up slowly, wincing as the movement pulled at his stitched wound, and looked around the small cottage with an expression that mixed confusion with something like disbelief. He asked if she understood what she had seen the night before, if she understood what he was. Elena admitted she did not fully understand, but she had seen enough to know he was not simply a man, and not simply a beast either. He told her, then, in careful, measured words, that most people who saw his true form did not live to speak of it. He said it was not because he wished them harm, but because the sight itself, the horror and confusion of witnessing something so unnatural, was often enough to stop a heart or send a mind spiraling into madness. He said she should have run. He said she should have screamed and fled into the forest and prayed she found her way home before the storm swallowed her whole. Instead, she had knelt beside him and pressed bandages to his wounds, as if he were nothing more than an injured traveler. Elena did not know how to answer that. She simply told him the truth, that she had heard something in pain, and pain was pain, whether it came from a man, or a beast, or something in between. She told him that turning away from suffering had never made sense to her, not since she was a child watching her mentor treat the sick and injured of Draymore without ever asking who they were, or what they had done to deserve their wounds. The man studied her for a long moment, something shifting behind his stormy eyes, though she could not name what it was. He introduced himself, finally, as Castian, though he offered no family name, no title, nothing that might explain the strange power radiating from him, even in his weakened state. He asked her name in return, and she gave it, feeling suddenly exposed under the weight of his attention. He tried to stand, insisting he needed to leave before anyone discovered him there, but his legs buckled beneath him, the wound still too fresh for him to move with any real strength. Elena caught him before he fell, guiding him back down to the makeshift bed she had prepared by the fire, scolding him with the same firm tone she used on stubborn patients who refused to rest. For a moment, something almost like amusement flickered across his face, quickly replaced by the guarded expression he seemed to wear like armor. He warned her, before exhaustion pulled him back into sleep, that she needed to forget what she had seen. He told her that speaking of it to anyone, even her closest friends, could bring danger to her door that she could not imagine. Elena promised, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered how she could ever forget the sight of a beast transforming into a man beneath her own hands. Over the following 2 days, she nursed him back to strength, changing his bandages, bringing him broth and bread, watching as the color slowly returned to his face. He spoke little at first, offering only clipped answers to her questions, his guard never fully lowering, even as his body healed. But Elena noticed small things, the way his eyes softened slightly when she hummed while working, the way he watched her hands as she ground herbs for poultices, as if the simple, practiced motion fascinated him, the way he seemed to relax, just slightly, whenever the fire crackled and the cottage filled with warmth and quiet. On the 3rd morning, he was strong enough to stand without assistance, and Elena knew their time together was drawing to a close. She helped him into a spare cloak that had belonged to her late father, adjusting it over his broad shoulders, trying not to notice how close they stood in the small space of her cottage. He thanked her, formally at first, the words stiff and practiced, before something in his expression cracked slightly, and he added, more quietly, that he owed her a debt he was not certain he could ever repay. Elena told him she wanted nothing in return, but helping him had been the only choice she could have made. He studied her again with that same searching intensity, as though trying to understand a puzzle that refused to make sense, no matter how he turned it over in his mind. Before he left, he paused at her door and turned back to face her one final time. He told her that few people in his life had ever shown him kindness without expecting something in return, and fewer still had looked upon his cursed form without fear consuming them entirely. He said her name once more, as though testing the weight of it, and told her that their paths were unlikely to cross again, given who and what he was. Elena watched him disappear into the morning mist, his stride steady now despite his injuries, and told herself that whatever strange encounter had brought him to her door was over. She had patched a stranger's wounds, kept his secret, and now her life would return to its quiet, ordinary rhythm. She busied herself in the days that followed with her usual duties, tending to the sick of Draymore alongside Agatha, trying to push the memory of stormy gray eyes and impossible transformations to the back of her mind. But the memory refused to fade, and less than a week later, when a royal messenger arrived in the village square, astride a horse bearing the crest of the Northern Kingdom, asking specifically for a healer's apprentice named Elena Voss, she understood, with a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn wind, that her ordinary life had ended the moment she knelt beside a wounded beast in the storm. The messenger's horse stamped and snorted in the village square, drawing every eye in Draymore toward the stranger in royal colors, and Elena's stomach dropped the moment she heard her own name called out over the murmuring crowd. She had spent the last week convincing herself that Castian was gone from her life for good, that the strange night in the storm had been nothing more than an unlikely, unrepeatable event. Now, standing frozen beside a basket of dried herbs, she watched the messenger dismount and search the crowd with sharp, official eyes, and she knew with sudden certainty that her quiet life was about to end. Agatha appeared at her side within moments, her weathered hand gripping Elena's arm with surprising strength. The old healer had lived long enough to know that royal messengers rarely brought good news to small border villages, and her sharp eyes studied Elena's pale face with obvious suspicion. She asked, in a low voice meant only for Elena, what exactly her apprentice had gotten herself involved in during that terrible storm the week before. Elena had told her only a partial truth, that she had helped a wounded traveler in the forest and sent him on his way. She had not mentioned claws, or fur, or the impossible transformation she still saw whenever she closed her eyes at night. There was no time to explain further. The messenger had already spotted her, striding across the square with the confident authority of someone accustomed to obedience. He announced, loud enough for the gathered villagers to hear, that Elena Voss was summoned to the royal castle by order of the crown, that transportation had been arranged, and that she was expected to depart within the hour. Whispers rippled through the crowd immediately, villagers exchanging confused and worried glances, wondering what a simple healer's apprentice could possibly have done to draw the attention of the throne. Elena's mind raced through every possibility, though only one made any sense at all. Somehow, word had reached the castle that she had treated a wounded stranger in the storm, and that stranger had not been ordinary. She thought of Castian's warning, his insistence that she forget what she had seen, and wondered if this summons meant she had failed to keep his secret, or if it meant something else entirely, something she could not yet imagine. Agatha pulled her aside before she could respond to the messenger, gripping both of Elena's shoulders with fierce, protective intensity. She warned her that royal summons rarely ended well for common folk, that the nobility used and discarded people like tools whenever it suited their purposes. She urged Elena to refuse, to claim illness, to do anything necessary to avoid whatever fate awaited her within those castle walls. But even as Agatha spoke, Elena understood there was no real choice being offered. A summons from the crown was not a request. Refusing would bring consequences not just for her, but potentially for the entire village that had sheltered her all her life. She gathered what few belongings she owned with trembling hands, her mind still spinning with unanswered questions. Agatha pressed a small pouch of dried herbs into her palm before she left, along with a fierce embrace and a whispered instruction to remember everything the old healer had ever taught her about survival, about reading people, about knowing when to speak and when silence served better. Elena promised she would write when she could, though neither of them believed the promise would be easy to keep once the castle gates closed behind her. The carriage that carried her north was finer than anything Elena had ever ridden in, its interior lined with soft cushions and warm blankets, though the luxury did little to ease the anxiety twisting through her chest. She watched the familiar hills of her childhood disappear behind her, replaced gradually by unfamiliar countryside, thick forests giving way to open fields, and eventually to the looming silhouette of a castle, perched atop a distant ridge, its dark towers piercing a sky heavy with clouds. The journey took the better part of 2 days, and Elena spent much of it staring out the carriage window, rehearsing explanations she might offer if questioned about the wounded stranger, though nothing she practiced felt adequate. She wondered if Castian himself had ordered this summons, or if someone else within the castle had somehow learned of their encounter and decided her fate independently. The uncertainty gnawed at her more than any clear danger could have, because at least a known threat could be prepared for. When the carriage finally rolled through the massive iron gates of the castle, Elena's breath caught at the sheer scale of the place. Towers rose higher than any structure she had ever seen, dark stone walls stretching in every direction, banners bearing an unfamiliar crest snapping in the wind atop the battlements. Guards in polished armor stood at rigid attention along the courtyard, their expressions unreadable, and Elena felt smaller and more out of place than she had ever felt in her entire life. A stern-faced woman named Priscilla met her carriage, introducing herself curtly as the head of household staff, before ushering Elena through a maze of corridors so elaborate she quickly lost any sense of direction. Priscilla explained, in clipped tones that offered no room for questions, that Elena had been summoned to serve as an herbalist within the castle, tasked with maintaining the royal gardens and preparing remedies for the household. The explanation seemed reasonable enough on its surface, ordinary even, but something in Priscilla's careful phrasing made Elena suspect there was more to the story than a simple need for medicinal herbs. She was given a small but comfortable chamber near the castle's eastern wing, sparse but clean, with a narrow bed and a window overlooking a walled garden below. Priscilla informed her that her duties would begin the following morning, and that she was expected to remain within the castle grounds unless given explicit permission to leave. The instruction carried an unmistakable weight of warning, and Elena understood, even without being told directly, that she was now more prisoner than guest, however comfortable her surroundings might appear. That evening, alone in her new chamber, Elena found herself pacing the small room, unable to settle despite her exhaustion from the journey. Her thoughts kept returning to Castian, wondering if he even knew she had been brought here, wondering if he had orchestrated this summons himself, or if some other force within the castle had taken an interest in her involvement with his curse. She thought of his warning about danger she could not imagine, and wondered if she was now standing in the very heart of that danger. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts sometime after darkness had fully settled over the castle grounds. When she opened the door, expecting perhaps a servant with evening supplies, she instead found herself face to face with Castian himself, dressed now in fine clothing, befitting his true station, though his expression carried the same guarded intensity she remembered from their first meeting. Behind him, the corridor stood empty, torchlight flickering against stone walls, and for a long moment neither of them spoke. He stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, closing the door quietly behind him, and Elena's heart pounded as she finally understood the truth she had suspected since the messenger first called her name in the village square. The wounded stranger she had saved was no ordinary nobleman. He was the ruler of this entire kingdom, the Alpha King himself, cursed and feared by every soul within these walls, and she was standing alone in a small chamber with him, uncertain whether she had just been granted an extraordinary honor or condemned to an extraordinary danger. Castian's eyes swept over her small chamber, before settling back on her face, and Elena realized her hands were trembling only when she noticed him glance down at them. She forced herself to still the shaking, lifting her chin with a courage she did not entirely feel, and asked him directly why she had been brought to the castle. She told him she deserved an honest answer, not vague explanations about herbalists and gardens delivered by a stern-faced woman who clearly knew more than she was willing to share. He studied her for a long moment before answering, his voice low and measured, carrying the weight of a man unaccustomed to explaining himself to anyone. He admitted that he had learned of her summons only after it had already been issued, that his advisors had acted on their own initiative once word reached them of a village healer who had treated the king's wounds and survived the sight of his cursed form. He explained that such an event was unprecedented in living memory, and his council had grown curious, and perhaps wary, about what her survival might mean. Elena asked what exactly they believed it meant, and Castian's expression darkened slightly, as he admitted he did not fully know either. He told her that everyone who had witnessed his true form in the past, servants, soldiers, even members of his own family generations ago, had either died from the shock or fled the kingdom entirely, unable to bear the memory. Her calm response, her willingness to kneel beside him and tend his wounds without hesitation, defied everything his court believed about the nature of his curse. He moved further into the room, his presence somehow filling the small space entirely, and Elena found herself acutely aware of how close he stood. He told her, more quietly now, that he had come to her chamber that evening, not because his council had demanded it, but because he wanted to see for himself that she had arrived safely, and to offer what reassurance he could that no harm would come to her within these walls. Elena searched his face, trying to determine whether she believed him, and found herself surprised by how much she wanted to. She asked him, gathering her courage, about the curse itself, about how it had come to exist, and why it seemed to torment his entire bloodline. Castian's jaw tightened, and for a moment she thought he might refuse to answer, might retreat back into the guarded silence she remembered from their first encounter. Instead, he sat heavily in the room's only chair, running a hand through his dark hair, and began to speak of things he clearly had not shared with anyone in a very long time. He told her the curse originated generations ago, placed upon his family line by a sorceress betrayed by one of his ancestors. The details were murky even to him, passed down through fragmented court records and whispered legends rather than clear historical account, but the effect had remained consistent and merciless across every generation since. Each ruler in his bloodline was doomed to transform, unpredictably and violently, into a beast form that inspired terror in anyone who witnessed it. Most of his ancestors had died young, either from the physical toll of the transformations, or from conflicts arising when their true nature was discovered by enemies, seeking to exploit their vulnerability. Elena listened without interrupting, understanding now why the court feared him, why servants scattered whenever he passed through corridors, why even his own advisors seemed to maintain careful distance in their dealings with him. She asked if there had ever been any attempt to break the curse, any effort by past sorcerers or healers to free his family from this suffering. Castian's expression grew distant, and he admitted that countless attempts had been made over the centuries, all of them failures, some of them costing the lives of well-meaning healers who had tried and failed to undo magic, far older and more complex than they understood. He warned her, then, with unmistakable seriousness, that she should not allow her unusual reaction to his cursed form to convince her that she held some special power to end his suffering. He told her that hope, in his experience, was often more dangerous than despair, because hope invited people to take foolish risks in pursuit of impossible outcomes. Elena felt a flicker of something like defiance at his words, though she kept her expression carefully neutral, unwilling to reveal thoughts she had not yet fully examined herself. Their conversation shifted, eventually, toward lighter subjects, though Elena sensed Castian remained guarded, even as he asked about her life in Draymore, about her training under Agatha, about the small, ordinary details of village life he seemed genuinely curious to learn. She found herself relaxing slightly as she spoke, describing the healing garden behind Agatha's cottage, the herbs she had learned to identify by scent alone, the satisfaction of watching a sick patient recover under her careful attention. Castian listened with an intensity that surprised her, his stormy eyes fixed on her face, as though her simple stories held genuine fascination for him. He stayed longer than either of them likely intended, the conversation stretching well into the night hours, until finally, he seemed to catch himself, straightening abruptly, and offering a stiff apology for keeping her from much-needed rest after her long journey. Elena assured him she had not minded the company, and something in his expression softened slightly at her words, though he quickly masked it beneath his usual guarded composure. Before leaving, he informed her that she would meet with his council the following morning, that they would want to question her themselves about the events in the forest, and he warned her to answer carefully, revealing only what was necessary. He told her the court was a place of shifting loyalties and hidden agendas, and that not everyone within these walls could be trusted with the full truth of what she had witnessed. Elena promised to be careful, though she could not shake the feeling that navigating castle politics would prove far more treacherous than tending to storm-wounded strangers in the forest. The following morning arrived too quickly, and Elena found herself standing before a long table in an imposing council chamber, facing a row of advisors whose expressions ranged from openly suspicious to coldly calculating. An older man named Edwin, who introduced himself as the king's chief advisor, led the questioning with a precision that made Elena feel as though every word she spoke was being weighed and measured for hidden meaning. He asked her to recount the events in the forest in exact detail, pressing her repeatedly on specific points, particularly her reaction to witnessing the king's transformation and her decision to help him rather than flee. Elena answered as honestly as she dared, careful to follow Castian's warning without appearing evasive, and she noticed several council members exchanging meaningful glances as she spoke. A younger woman among the advisors, introduced as Beatrice, seemed particularly interested in the physical details of the transformation itself, asking pointed questions about how the change had occurred, how long it had taken, whether Elena had noticed anything unusual about the magic involved. Something about Beatrice's line of questioning unsettled Elena, though she could not immediately identify why. By the time the council finally dismissed her, hours later, Elena felt drained in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. She returned to her chamber and sat heavily on the edge of her narrow bed, replaying the interrogation in her mind, trying to determine whether she had said too much or too little, whether she had inadvertently placed herself or Castian in greater danger through her honest answers. The castle, she was beginning to understand, was a far more dangerous place than the storm-ravaged forest where she had first encountered its cursed king, and she suspected the true challenges of her new life had only just begun. 3 weeks passed before Elena felt she could walk the castle corridors without the constant fear of being watched, though the feeling never fully disappeared. She settled into her new duties tending the royal gardens, cultivating medicinal herbs alongside the castle's small staff of servants, most of whom kept a careful, respectful distance from her once word spread of how she had come to be there. She did not mind the solitude entirely, having grown accustomed to quiet work during her years apprenticing under Agatha, though the whispers that followed her through hallways reminded her constantly that she remained an outsider within these walls. Castian's visits to the garden began subtly, almost accidentally at first, as though he simply happened to be passing through during her working hours. He would linger at the edge of the herb beds, watching her work with quiet interest, occasionally asking questions about the plants she cultivated or their medicinal properties. Elena found herself looking forward to these brief interruptions more than she cared to admit, the king's guarded presence gradually becoming a familiar and even comforting part of her days. She learned, through these conversations and through careful observation of court life, that Castian carried burdens far heavier than simply his curse. He ruled a kingdom that both feared and depended on him, surrounded by advisors who offered counsel shaped as much by their own ambitions as by genuine loyalty to the crown. Edwin, the chief advisor, seemed particularly skilled at steering conversations toward outcomes that benefited his own influence, and Elena noticed Castian often deferred to his judgment, even when something in his expression suggested private disagreement. One afternoon, as autumn winds stripped the last leaves from the garden's ornamental trees, Castian found her replanting a bed of healing herbs that had been damaged by an early frost. He knelt beside her without invitation, his fine clothing entirely inappropriate for garden work, and began helping her clear away the dead foliage with surprisingly careful hands. Elena glanced at him with amused disbelief, asking if the ruler of an entire kingdom truly had nothing better to occupy his time than digging in dirt beside his herbalist. He offered her a rare, genuine smile in response, something she had seen only glimpses of before, and admitted that council meetings had grown particularly tedious that morning, filled with tedious arguments over grain taxation that he found himself entirely uninterested in resolving. He said her garden offered a peace he found nowhere else within the castle walls, and Elena felt something warm bloom in her chest at his admission, though she quickly turned her attention back to the herbs to hide whatever expression might have crossed her face. Their conversation drifted, as it often did during these stolen moments, toward more personal territory. Castian spoke, haltingly at first, of his childhood, of watching his father struggle beneath the weight of the same curse that now defined his own existence, of learning from a young age that trust was a luxury rulers of his bloodline could rarely afford. He told her of losing his mother when he was still a boy, of advisors who had raised him more with strategy lessons than affection, of growing into adulthood believing that the curse made him fundamentally unlovable, a monster in truth rather than merely an unfortunate circumstance. Elena listened with growing sadness, understanding now why he carried himself with such careful guardedness, why genuine warmth seemed to surprise him whenever she offered it. She told him, gently, that a curse placed upon him by ancestors long dead said nothing about his own character, that the man who had knelt beside her in a storm-ravaged garden to help replant frost-damaged herbs was not a monster by any definition she recognized. Something shifted in his expression at her words, a vulnerability he rarely allowed himself to show, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, the silence between them charged with something neither seemed ready to name. He asked her, eventually, about her own losses, and Elena found herself speaking of her parents, both gone before she reached adulthood, of Agatha becoming something like family in their absence, of the quiet loneliness she had carried, even within the familiar comfort of Draymore, never quite feeling as though she belonged anywhere completely. Castian listened with the same intensity he always brought to their conversations, and when she finished speaking, he told her, quietly, that he understood that particular loneliness better than she might imagine. Their growing closeness did not go unnoticed within the castle. Priscilla began treating Elena with newfound caution, her earlier curt efficiency replaced by something more guarded and watchful. Beatrice, the council member who had questioned her so intensely during that first interrogation, took to appearing near the gardens with increasing frequency, her sharp eyes tracking Elena's interactions with the king with obvious interest. Elena tried to ignore the attention, though it left her with a persistent sense of unease she could not entirely shake. One evening, summoned to a small private dining hall, rather than her usual solitary meal in the servants' quarters, Elena found Castian waiting for her alone, the table set simply but elegantly, candlelight flickering warmly across the stone walls. He explained, somewhat awkwardly, that he had grown tired of formal court dinners filled with careful political maneuvering, and had wanted, for once, a meal shared with someone whose company he genuinely enjoyed rather than merely tolerated. They talked for hours that evening, the conversation flowing easily between lighter subjects and deeper reflections, and Elena found herself laughing more freely than she had since arriving at the castle, watching Castian's guarded composure gradually soften into something that resembled genuine happiness. He told her stories of his youth, occasionally self-deprecating, in ways that surprised her, and she shared memories of village festivals and Agatha's often eccentric teaching methods, the two of them trading stories like old friends, rather than a healer's apprentice, and the ruler of an entire kingdom. As the evening drew to a close, Castian walked her back toward her chamber personally, an unusual departure from castle protocol that she suspected would fuel further whispers among the staff. Outside her door, he paused, studying her face in the dim torchlight with an expression she could not quite decipher. He told her, quietly, that her presence in the castle had changed something in him that he had believed permanently settled, a hope he had long ago convinced himself was foolish to entertain. Elena's heart pounded as she asked what exactly he meant, though some part of her already understood, and Castian's answer, when it came, was not spoken but shown, his hand rising gently to brush a strand of hair from her face, his eyes searching hers for permission before he leaned closer. The moment stretched between them, charged and uncertain, until the sound of approaching footsteps in the corridor forced them apart, Castian stepping back with visible reluctance as a passing guard offered a respectful nod and continued on his patrol. The interrupted moment left Elena breathless and confused, her mind racing with questions she was not certain she was ready to answer. Castian offered a quiet good night, his expression carrying both regret and something warmer, before retreating down the corridor and leaving her alone with her thoughts. She entered her chamber and sat by the window for a long while, staring out at the moonlit garden below, understanding, with sudden clarity, that whatever was growing between them had moved far beyond the simple gratitude of a rescued stranger, and that the danger she now faced within these castle walls had far less to do with curses and far more to do with the vulnerability of her own undefended heart. The alarm bells rang across the castle grounds just before midnight, and Elena bolted upright in her bed, her heart hammering as shouts echoed through the corridors outside her chamber. She threw a cloak over her nightclothes and rushed to her door, finding servants and guards moving in urgent, chaotic patterns through the hallway. their faces pale with fear. A young stable hand, breathless and wide-eyed, told her that the king's curse had struck without warning during his private evening walk, and that he had transformed in full view of 2 guards, before disappearing into the castle's eastern woods. Elena's blood ran cold at the news. Castian had told her, during one of their quiet conversations, that his transformations usually followed some predictable rhythm tied to certain nights, but that occasionally, during moments of extreme stress or emotional turmoil, the curse struck unpredictably, seizing control of his body without the warning he had learned to prepare for. She thought immediately of their interrupted moment outside her chamber days earlier, of the vulnerability he had shown her, and wondered with growing dread whether the emotional weight of that evening had somehow triggered this unexpected transformation. She did not wait for permission or instruction. Grabbing her healer's satchel, she pushed past startled guards and made her way toward the eastern woods, ignoring the shouted warnings of servants who told her the area was far too dangerous, that the king in his current state might not recognize friend from threat. Elena had seen him wounded and vulnerable once before, had knelt beside him in a storm and found not a monster but a creature in pain, and she refused to believe this night would prove any different. The eastern woods were darker and denser than she had expected, moonlight barely penetrating the thick canopy above, and Elena moved carefully between the trees, following distant sounds of movement, and low, pained growling that made her chest tighten with worry. She called out softly, using his name the way she had months ago in the storm, keeping her voice calm and steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. She found him eventually in a small clearing, his massive beast form pacing restlessly, claws tearing at the earth, his breathing ragged and uneven. Unlike their first encounter, this transformation seemed to carry more violence within it, his movements erratic and unpredictable, in ways that made Elena's instincts scream at her to keep her distance. But she thought of everything she had learned about him since that stormy night, of the lonely boy who had grown into a guarded man convinced of his own unworthiness, and she stepped forward anyway, speaking his name again and again, until his wild, pained eyes finally settled on her. For a long, tense moment, neither of them moved. The beast's chest heaved with each breath, its massive form trembling with barely contained tension, and Elena held perfectly still, refusing to show the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Slowly, carefully, she lowered herself to the ground, sitting cross-legged in the dirt exactly as she had done during their first meeting, and began speaking to him, in the same soft, steady voice she had used that stormy night, telling him he was safe, that she was not afraid, that whatever pain gripped him would pass. Gradually, the tension in his massive frame began to ease. He approached her slowly, his movements less erratic now, until finally, he lowered his great head into her lap, his heavy breathing beginning to steady beneath her gentle touch. Elena stroked the thick fur along his neck, continuing her quiet murmuring, and felt something in her own chest ease as well, a bond forming between them in that clearing that went far beyond simple gratitude or curiosity. They remained that way for nearly an hour, until finally his form began its familiar transformation, back into the man she had come to know so well. When the change completed itself, Castian lay exhausted in her lap, his human form drained by the unexpected transformation, and Elena gently helped him sit up, wrapping her own cloak around his shoulders against the night chill. He apologized immediately, his voice hoarse with exhaustion and something that sounded almost like shame, telling her he had never lost control so completely in front of anyone before, that the emotional turmoil of recent days had clearly weakened whatever restraint he normally maintained over the curse. Elena told him firmly that he had nothing to apologize for, that curses were not choices, that the vulnerability he had shown her tonight only confirmed what she already believed about the good, decent man buried beneath centuries of inherited suffering. He studied her in the moonlight, something raw and unguarded in his expression, and told her that no one, not his advisors, not even members of his own family in years past, had ever witnessed him in such a state without recoiling in horror or disgust. Elena told him, simply, that she saw no monster before her, only a man who had spent his entire life believing himself unworthy of the very compassion he deserved. Something shifted between them in that clearing, the careful boundaries they had both maintained, finally dissolving beneath the weight of shared vulnerability. Castian reached for her hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and asked if she understood what she was offering him, what it might mean for someone in her position to become entangled with a cursed king who could never fully promise her safety or normalcy. Elena answered by leaning forward and closing the distance between them entirely, her lips meeting his in a kiss that carried every unspoken feeling that had grown between them since that first stormy night. The moment their lips touched, something extraordinary happened. A warm, golden light erupted from where their hands remained joined, spreading outward in pulsing waves that illuminated the entire clearing with brilliant, impossible radiance. Castian gasped against her mouth, pulling back with wide, startled eyes as the light intensified, wrapping around his entire body in glowing tendrils that seemed to pull something ancient and dark up from deep within him. Elena watched in stunned amazement as centuries-old magic unraveled before her eyes, the curse that had haunted his bloodline for generations, finally shattering apart in brilliant bursts of light that faded slowly into the night sky. Castian collapsed forward, and she caught him instinctively, both of them breathing hard, as the clearing gradually darkened back to ordinary moonlight, the extraordinary magic display finally settling into silence. When he finally lifted his head to look at her, his stormy eyes held an expression she had never seen there before, something unburdened and hopeful, though tinged with disbelieving confusion. He told her, his voice barely above a whisper, that he could feel something different within himself, a heaviness lifted, that he had carried for so long, he had forgotten what its absence might feel like. Elena helped him to his feet, both of them still shaking with the aftermath of whatever magic had just transpired between them, and together, they made their way back toward the castle, uncertain exactly what they had just witnessed, but sensing, with growing unease beneath the joy, that something profound and irreversible had just occurred. News of the broken curse spread through the castle by dawn, and by midday, celebration had erupted across the kingdom, church bells ringing in every village within reach of a messenger's swift horse. Elena stood beside Castian on the castle's grand balcony, as crowds gathered in the courtyard below, cheering and weeping with a relief that had been generations in the making, finally free of the fear that had shadowed every ruler of his bloodline since the original curse had been cast. Castian looked younger somehow, standing there in the bright morning sunlight, his shoulders less burdened, his guarded expression softened into something approaching genuine happiness. Edwin organized a formal feast within days, the castle's great hall transformed, with banners and flowers, musicians filling the space with celebratory music that Elena had never before heard echo through those ancient stone walls. She found herself seated beside Castian at the head table, his hand occasionally finding hers beneath the tablecloth, both of them exchanging small, private smiles amid the formal pageantry surrounding them. For the first time since arriving at the castle months earlier, Elena allowed herself to believe that perhaps their story might unfold exactly as it seemed, a healer's apprentice and a once cursed king, finally free to build a future together, without the shadow of ancient magic hanging over them. But even amid the celebration, small, troubling signs began to surface. Elena noticed Castian occasionally pause mid-conversation, his expression flickering with something like confusion or distant pain, quickly masked before anyone else seemed to notice. During the feast itself, she watched his hand tremble slightly as he lifted his goblet, a tremor he quickly steadied when he caught her observing him. She told herself it was simply exhaustion, the emotional and physical toll of breaking a centuries-old curse, finally catching up with him after the excitement of celebration faded. That night, however, as she prepared for sleep in her chamber, she heard raised voices echoing from somewhere deeper within the castle, followed by the unmistakable sound of shattering glass. She rushed toward the source of the commotion, finding a small crowd gathered outside Castian's private study, guards standing with drawn swords, though clearly uncertain what threat they were meant to be defending against. Priscilla emerged from the study, her face ashen, and told the gathered crowd that the king required privacy, that nothing was wrong, though her trembling hands suggested otherwise. Elena pushed past the guards despite their protests, entering the study to find Castian standing amid broken glass and overturned furniture, his breathing heavy, his eyes carrying an unfamiliar wildness that had nothing to do with his old curse. He looked at her with something like fear in his expression, backing away slightly as she approached, warning her to keep her distance in a voice that sounded strained, almost foreign compared to the man she had come to know. She asked him, gently, what had happened, and he struggled to explain, describing a sudden surge of overwhelming strength and rage that had seized him without warning, an urge to destroy that felt entirely unlike anything the old curse had ever produced. He told her the sensation had felt less like transformation and more like something clawing its way up from deep within him, something that had never been part of the curse she had broken, but had instead been contained by it all along. Elena felt a chill settle over her despite the warmth of the study's fireplace. She thought back to the ancient stories Agatha had once told her, fragments of legend about the very first ruler of this bloodline, a figure whose name had been largely erased from official history, remembered only in whispered warnings about power too dangerous for any single person to wield safely. She had always assumed those stories referred to the origin of the curse itself, but now, watching Castian struggle to control tremors that clearly frightened him, she began to wonder if the curse had never been the true danger at all, but rather the only thing standing between the kingdom and something far more destructive. Over the following days, similar incidents occurred with increasing frequency. A guard reported witnessing Castian's eyes flash an unnatural shade of amber during a routine training exercise, accompanied by a burst of strength that sent his sparring partner flying several feet before Castian caught himself and apologized profusely, clearly disturbed by his own capabilities. A servant fainted after glimpsing shadows seeming to writhe unnaturally around the king during a late evening walk through the castle gardens. Whispers began circulating among the staff once again, though this time, the fear in their eyes carried a different quality than the wary respect they had once shown their cursed monarch. Edwin called an emergency council meeting, and Elena, uninvited but unwilling to be excluded, insisted on attending despite Priscilla's obvious disapproval. The advisors spoke in careful, measured tones, though Elena could sense the underlying panic beneath their diplomatic language. Beatrice, in particular, seemed to have anticipated this exact scenario, producing ancient texts and scrolls that she claimed detailed the true origins of the royal bloodline's affliction, documents that had apparently been sealed away in the castle's most restricted archives for generations. According to Beatrice's research, the curse had never simply been a punishment inflicted by a vengeful sorceress. Rather, it had been a desperate containment measure, crafted by the very first sorceress to bind and suppress a devastating power that had once nearly destroyed the entire kingdom centuries earlier, when the original Alpha King had lost control of an ancient, primal force flowing through his bloodline and unleashed destruction across the land, before finally being stopped through combined magical intervention. Elena listened with growing horror as Beatrice explained that the curse had essentially trapped that dangerous power within each subsequent ruler's beast form, channeling and containing what would otherwise be an uncontrollable force through the transformation itself, allowing the power periodic release in a form that, while frightening, remained largely manageable and contained. By breaking the curse entirely, rather than simply lifting the beast transformation, Elena's kiss had inadvertently severed the containment mechanism altogether, leaving the ancient power within Castian free to surface without the structure that had kept it in check for centuries. The room fell into stunned silence as the implications settled over everyone present. Castian, seated at the head of the table, stared at his own hands as though they belonged to a stranger, and Elena felt sick with the growing realization that her act of love, meant to free him from generations of suffering, may have instead unleashed something far more dangerous than the curse it had replaced. The council chamber erupted into chaos moments after Beatrice finished her explanation, advisors shouting over one another with competing suggestions, some demanding immediate restraint measures against the king, others insisting the ancient texts could not possibly be accurate after so many centuries of uncertain translation and speculation. Elena sat frozen amid the noise, her mind replaying every moment since that clearing in the eastern woods, searching for some detail she might have missed, some warning sign she had overlooked in her rush to free Castian from his suffering. Castian himself remained eerily silent through the escalating argument, his gaze fixed on some distant point beyond the chamber walls, and Elena recognized in his expression the same haunted look he had worn during their very first conversation, when he had spoken of believing himself fundamentally unworthy of love or peace. She reached beneath the table and found his hand, gripping it firmly despite the trembling she felt in his fingers, and though he did not look at her, she felt his grip tighten in response, a silent acknowledgement that her presence still mattered amid the growing crisis. Edwin finally restored order by slamming his palm against the table, his authoritative voice cutting through the competing arguments with practiced ease. He proposed a measured approach, suggesting the council commission a thorough investigation into the ancient texts, while implementing careful precautionary measures to protect both the king and the kingdom in the meantime. Beatrice objected immediately, arguing that precaution was insufficient, given the historical devastation attributed to this same power centuries earlier, insisting instead on immediate confinement measures that Elena recognized, with rising alarm, sounded uncomfortably similar to imprisonment. Castian spoke for the first time since the discussion began, his voice quiet but carrying enough authority to silence the room instantly. He told his council that he would not be confined like a prisoner within his own castle, that whatever power now stirred within him remained, for the moment, under his control, and that he would not allow fear to dictate policy before they understood the true nature of the threat they faced. His words carried conviction, though Elena noticed the slight tremor still present in his hand beneath the table, and wondered if his confidence was as solid as he wished his council to believe. The meeting concluded without clear resolution, advisors dispersing with worried expressions and hushed conversations trailing behind them. Elena remained behind with Castian as the chamber emptied, and once they were finally alone, his carefully maintained composure finally cracked. He pressed his palms against his eyes, his shoulders shaking slightly, and admitted to her, in a voice raw with fear he had concealed from his counsel, that he could feel the power building within him even now, a pressure behind his eyes and beneath his skin that felt entirely unlike the familiar rhythm of his old curse. Elena moved to stand beside him, wrapping her arms around his shoulders, despite his initial resistance, and told him firmly that they would find a way through this together, exactly as they had found their way through everything since that stormy night in the forest. Castian turned to face her, his eyes searching hers with desperate uncertainty, and asked if she regretted what had happened in that clearing, if she wished she had never broken the curse that had, however imperfectly, kept this darker power contained for so long. She answered without hesitation, telling him she could never regret loving him, that whatever challenges now faced them, they would face as partners rather than as a cursed monster and his reluctant savior. Something in her certainty seemed to steady him slightly, and he pulled her closer, resting his forehead against hers in a gesture of quiet, desperate gratitude that spoke louder than any words could have managed. Over the following days, Elena threw herself into research alongside Beatrice, poring over ancient texts and fragmented historical records in the castle's restricted archives, searching for any detail that might illuminate a path forward. The work proved slow and frustrating, many of the oldest documents damaged by time and written in archaic dialects that required painstaking translation. Beatrice, despite Elena's initial suspicion of her motives, proved to be a genuine ally in this crisis. Her earlier interrogation of Elena revealed now to have stemmed from scholarly caution, rather than any malicious intent. Through their combined research, they slowly pieced together a clearer picture of the ancient power's origins. It appeared to be connected to an even older bloodline, one that had merged with Castian's ancestors through a marriage centuries before the original curse was cast, bringing with it a primal, elemental force that had proven too volatile for any single person to fully master. The sorceress who had cast the original curse had apparently understood this danger clearly, crafting her spell not as simple punishment, but as a careful containment structure meant to allow the bloodline to survive while preventing catastrophic loss of control. Elena discovered, buried within one particularly fragile scroll, references to a possible alternative to full containment, an ancient practice involving what the text called anchoring, a bond between the afflicted individual and another person capable of providing emotional and, apparently, magical stability, strong enough to allow controlled access to the power, rather than either full suppression or catastrophic release. The text was frustratingly incomplete, damaged too severely to reveal the precise nature of this anchoring bond, but Elena felt a spark of hope for the first time since the crisis began. She brought her findings to Castian that evening, finding him alone in his private chambers, staring out at the darkening sky, with an expression of weary resignation that broke her heart. She explained what she had discovered, watching hope flicker cautiously in his eyes as she spoke, though he remained guarded, warning her that incomplete ancient texts had led countless well-meaning healers astray throughout his family's long, troubled history. Elena told him she understood the risk, but that she refused to accept confinement or suppression as the only available options when a third path might exist. She reminded him of their kiss in that clearing, of the golden light that had erupted between them. Evidence, she argued, that some genuine connection existed between them, capable of interacting with whatever ancient magic ran through his bloodline. Castian studied her for a long moment, something fierce and protective flickering across his features, and finally admitted that if any bond in this world was strong enough to anchor him against whatever darkness now stirred within his blood, he believed with his whole heart that it would be the bond he shared with her. A sudden crash from the castle's northern tower shattered the fragile calm that had settled over the following week, and Elena bolted from her research in the archives to find servants fleeing down the corridors in terrified confusion. A guard, his armor dented and his face pale with shock, told her that the king had lost control entirely during a routine inspection of the tower's defenses, his amber eyes flashing with a power that had sent stone crumbling and thrown 3 armed guards aside as though they weighed nothing at all. Elena's heart pounded as she raced toward the tower, ignoring warnings shouted after her, her mind consumed with fear that the anchoring bond she had discovered in the ancient texts had come too late to matter. She found Castian at the tower's summit, his form still human but surrounded by a visible distortion in the air itself, dark energy crackling around him like a living thing, his amber eyes wild and unfocused as he stared at the destruction he had wrought, without seeming to fully comprehend it. She called his name, and for a terrifying moment, he did not respond, his attention seemingly consumed by whatever force now battled for control within him. She stepped closer despite the danger, remembering the same courage that had carried her into a storm-ravaged forest months earlier, and reached for his hand, exactly as she had done in that clearing, when the curse had first broken. The moment their fingers touched, the crackling energy around him seemed to falter, his amber eyes flickering briefly back toward their familiar stormy gray, before the darker power surged forward again, fighting against her influence with terrifying strength. Beatrice arrived moments later, breathless from her own race up the tower stairs, carrying with her a small collection of items, gathered hastily from the archives. Ancient tools she believed might assist in strengthening whatever anchoring bond existed between Elena and Castian. She instructed Elena quickly, her voice tight with urgency, explaining that the texts suggested physical and emotional connection needed to be paired with deliberate intention, a conscious choice to bind, rather than simply hope proximity alone would prove sufficient. Elena did not hesitate. She wrapped both hands around Castian's, pressing herself close despite the dangerous energy still crackling around him, and spoke directly to whatever remained of the man she loved buried beneath the surging ancient power. She told him she was not afraid, that she had never been afraid of him, not in the storm, not in that clearing, not now, and that whatever ancient force ran through his blood did not define who he truly was, any more than the curse ever had. For a long, agonizing moment, nothing changed, the dark energy continuing to churn violently around them both. Then, gradually, Elena felt something shift, a warmth beginning to build between their joined hands, similar to, but distinct from, the golden light that had accompanied their first kiss in the clearing. Castian's amber eyes flickered again, longer this time, his stormy gray gaze breaking through with visible effort, and Elena held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away, even as the energy around them intensified before beginning, slowly, to recede. Beatrice watched with amazed relief as the crackling darkness gradually dissipated, the stones of the tower settling back into their proper places, as though the destruction were slowly reversing itself. Castian collapsed forward, exhausted, and Elena caught him just as she had done during that first night in the eastern woods, both of them sinking to the tower floor amid the aftermath of what had nearly become a catastrophic loss of control. When he finally recovered enough to speak, his voice was hoarse and shaken, and he told her that he had felt himself disappearing entirely during those terrifying moments, the ancient power seizing control so completely that he had feared he might never find his way back to himself. He credited her presence, her steady voice and unwavering courage, with anchoring him back to his own identity, when the darkness had threatened to consume him entirely. Elena held him close, her own body trembling with the aftermath of adrenaline and fear, grateful beyond words that the anchoring bond she had discovered in fragmented ancient texts had proven strong enough to matter when it counted most. News of the incident spread quickly through the castle despite attempts to contain the story, and the following days brought renewed panic among both nobility and common folk alike. Rumors reached beyond the castle walls, and Elena learned through worried reports from Edwin that rival kingdoms, long wary of the Northern Throne's cursed bloodline, had begun making inquiries about the kingdom's stability, some perhaps hoping to exploit any perceived weakness for their own political gain. The threat, she realized with growing dread, had expanded beyond simply managing Castian's internal struggle, to now include defending the kingdom itself from opportunistic enemies, circling at the first sign of vulnerability. Castian, still recovering from the tower incident, insisted on convening his full council once again, determined to address both the internal and external threats facing his kingdom, with the same directness that had always defined his leadership, curse or no curse. Elena stood beside him throughout the meeting, no longer merely a curious outsider tolerated by his advisors, but now recognized, even by the most skeptical among them, as an essential part of managing the crisis threatening the kingdom's future. Edwin proposed strengthening the castle's defenses, while quietly reaching out to neighboring allies who might offer support should hostile kingdoms attempt to take advantage of the current instability. Beatrice continued her research into the anchoring bond, seeking ways to formalize and strengthen the connection between Elena and Castian beyond simple proximity, believing that a more permanent and powerful bond might offer lasting protection against future episodes of lost control. Castian himself remained quietly resolute throughout the discussion, his earlier fear replaced by determined focus, though Elena noticed him glancing toward her frequently, as though drawing strength and reassurance simply from her steady presence beside him. That evening, alone together in his private chambers once again, Castian took her hands in his and told her, with quiet seriousness, that he intended to face whatever challenges lay ahead, not as a burden he carried alone, but as a partnership between equals, who had already proven, twice now, that their combined strength exceeded anything either of them could manage separately. Elena felt her heart swell with love and determination in equal measure, and told him she would stand beside him through whatever trials still awaited them, certain now more than ever that their bond, forged first in a storm and tested again atop a crumbling tower, was strong enough to carry them through the greater battle still looming on the horizon. Riders thundered through the castle gates at first light, their horses lathered and exhausted, carrying urgent warnings that sent the entire fortress into immediate alert. A neighboring kingdom to the west, long resentful of the Northern Throne's historical dominance and emboldened by rumors of the king's unstable new power, had mobilized their forces and were marching toward the border with clear hostile intent. Edwin received the reports with grim resignation, confirming what he had feared since the tower incident first became known beyond the castle walls, that enemies had indeed seized upon perceived weakness as an opportunity to strike. Castian called his war council together within the hour, and Elena watched him transform before her eyes into the commanding ruler his people needed in this moment of crisis, his earlier vulnerability replaced by decisive authority as he issued orders for defensive preparations across the kingdom. She felt a surge of pride watching him work, though fear coiled tightly in her chest as well, knowing that the stress and danger of impending conflict might easily trigger another catastrophic loss of control, potentially at the worst possible moment. Beatrice pulled her aside during a brief lull in the frantic preparations, her expression tight with concern, as she explained that her continued research had revealed something crucial about the anchoring bond they had used atop the tower. The connection, she believed, could be strengthened significantly through a formal ritual described in the ancient texts, one that would create a more permanent link between Elena and Castian, potentially allowing Elena to help him access and control the ancient power deliberately, rather than simply containing it during moments of crisis. The ritual, however, carried genuine risk, requiring both participants to willingly open themselves entirely to the ancient magic flowing between them, with no guarantee of the outcome. Elena did not hesitate before agreeing to attempt the ritual, understanding that the coming battle might well require every advantage they could muster. She found Castian later that evening, exhausted from hours of strategic planning, and explained Beatrice's proposal, watching his expression shift from concern for her safety to reluctant acknowledgement that they might have no better option available, given the urgency of their situation. They performed the ritual that same night, guided by Beatrice's careful instructions, in the same tower, where Castian had nearly lost himself entirely to the ancient power days earlier. Elena felt fear mixed with determination as she followed the ritual's requirements, joining hands with Castian, while Beatrice traced ancient symbols around them and spoke words in a language Elena did not recognize but felt resonate deep within her chest. The golden light that had accompanied their first kiss returned, more intense this time, spiraling around them both in brilliant patterns before finally settling, leaving Elena with a strange new awareness, as though some part of her consciousness now remained permanently connected to Castian's, in ways she could not fully articulate but instinctively understood. The following days passed in a blur of preparation as the Western army drew steadily closer to the kingdom's borders. Castian, drawing on the strengthened bond forged through the ritual, found himself able to access controlled fragments of the ancient power for the first time, testing careful bursts of strength and heightened awareness during training exercises with his most trusted soldiers, always with Elena present, her steady influence allowing him to maintain control in ways that would have been impossible only days earlier. When the Western forces finally reached the kingdom's border, Castian rode out to meet them personally, Elena remaining close behind alongside his most loyal guards, understanding that her presence might prove essential should the ancient power need to be called upon during the conflict ahead. The battlefield stretched before them beneath a gray, overcast sky, both armies arrayed in tense anticipation, and Elena felt her heart pound with fear for the man she loved, knowing that whatever happened in the coming hours would determine not just the fate of the kingdom, but potentially their own future together as well. The battle began with brutal suddenness, soldiers clashing across the muddy field with desperate intensity, and Elena found herself drawn into the chaos, alongside the healers tending to wounded soldiers, even as she kept careful watch on Castian's position across the battlefield. When the Western commander, a ruthless and ambitious noble named Roland, pressed a devastating assault against the kingdom's central defenses, threatening to break through their lines entirely, Elena felt the connection forged through their ritual bond flare suddenly, with urgent intensity, a wordless communication passing between herself and Castian that told her he intended to call upon the ancient power fully, for the first time in open battle. She raced toward his position, despite the danger, understanding instinctively that her presence would be essential to maintaining his control should he need to draw fully upon the ancient force within him. She reached him just as amber light began flickering in his eyes, and rather than fear, she felt only determined resolve, gripping his hand tightly as she had done atop the crumbling tower, anchoring him firmly to his own identity, even as tremendous power surged through his body, allowing him controlled access to strength that turned the tide of battle decisively in the kingdom's favor. The Western forces, faced with power they had not anticipated and could not withstand, began a chaotic retreat within the hour, Roland himself fleeing the field alongside his surviving soldiers rather than face continued confrontation with a power clearly beyond anything they had prepared to counter. Cheers rose from the kingdom's remaining forces as the battlefield gradually quieted, and Elena finally allowed herself to release the breath she had been holding throughout the terrifying confrontation, relief flooding through her as Castian's amber eyes finally settled back into their familiar stormy gray, the ancient power receding once again beneath his controlled command. He turned to her amid the celebrating soldiers, his expression carrying exhausted gratitude and something deeper still, and told her that the victory belonged as much to her steady presence and unwavering courage as to any power flowing through his own blood. Elena, standing amid the aftermath of battle with the man she loved, safely returned to himself, felt a profound certainty settle over her, that whatever challenges still lay ahead, they would face them together, their bond now proven strong enough to withstand not just ancient magic, but the full weight of war itself. 3 months after the battle at the western border, Elena stood once again in the same castle garden where she had first felt the tentative beginnings of love bloom between herself and Castian, though everything about her life had transformed so completely that the memory felt as though it belonged to a different person entirely. The kingdom had settled into a fragile but genuine peace since the retreat of the Western forces, Roland's kingdom sending formal apologies and trade agreements meant to smooth relations after their failed aggression, and the castle itself had gradually returned to something resembling normal rhythm, though Elena suspected true normalcy would never again describe her strange, extraordinary life. Castian had continued working with Beatrice and other scholars to better understand the ancient power now flowing more freely through his bloodline, and while the process remained ongoing, he had grown increasingly confident in his ability to access and control it deliberately, rather than fearing its unpredictable emergence. The anchoring bond between himself and Elena had proven not just useful during moments of crisis, but had deepened into something Elena recognized as a genuine, permanent connection, one that occasionally allowed her to sense his emotional state, even from a distance, a strange but welcome side effect of the ritual they had performed together. Edwin and the rest of the council had gradually come to accept Elena's permanent presence within castle life, her role evolving from simple herbalist to something the court now openly acknowledged as essential to the kingdom's stability, though she suspected the formal titles and recognition mattered far less to her than the quiet, ordinary moments she continued to share with Castian amid their extraordinary circumstances. She still tended her garden daily, the familiar work grounding her even as her life had expanded to encompass responsibilities she never could have imagined during her quiet years in Draymore. Agatha had visited the castle twice since Elena's departure from the village, the old healer initially skeptical of the grand surroundings, but gradually won over by Castian's genuine warmth and obvious devotion to her former apprentice. During her most recent visit, Agatha had pulled Elena aside with tears in her eyes, telling her that whatever strange path had led her apprentice from a quiet village cottage to the halls of a castle, she had never seen Elena look so completely, unmistakably happy, and that happiness, more than any title or position, was the only measure of success that had ever truly mattered to the old healer. On a clear autumn afternoon, almost exactly 1 year after that first stormy night in the Ashwood Forest, Castian found Elena in the garden among the same herbs she had been tending when their unlikely romance first began to take root. He knelt beside her, exactly as he had done that afternoon months earlier when he had first helped her replant frost-damaged seedlings, though this time his expression carried a nervous energy she had rarely seen from him, even during their most dangerous confrontations with ancient magic and hostile armies. He took her hands in his fingers trembling slightly in a way that reminded her powerfully of that very first morning she had found him healing in her small village cottage, and told her that everything he had once believed about himself, that he was unworthy of love, destined to remain isolated by fear and ancient curses, had been completely and permanently transformed by her presence in his life. He told her that the anchoring bond between them had proven far more than simply a magical necessity, that it had become the truest expression of a love he had never dared believe he deserved to experience. From within his cloak, he produced a small ring, simple but elegant, crafted from silver and set with a stone that seemed to shift color subtly, between deep blue and warm gold, mirroring the very magic that had first drawn their fates together in that clearing months earlier. He asked her, his voice steady despite the emotion clearly evident in his stormy gray eyes, if she would choose to remain by his side, not simply as an anchor against ancient power, not simply as his kingdom's essential healer, but as his wife, his equal partner in whatever future still awaited them both. Elena felt tears gathering in her own eyes as she accepted, her answer requiring no hesitation after everything they had endured and overcome together since that first desperate night in the storm. Castian rose to meet her, pulling her into an embrace filled with the same golden warmth that had first accompanied their bond, and Elena understood, standing there in the garden that had witnessed so much of their unlikely story, that whatever challenges the future might still bring, ancient magic or political intrigue or simply the ordinary trials of building a life together, she and Castian would face them exactly as they had faced everything since that stormy encounter in the forest, not as a cursed king and his reluctant savior, but as two people who had chosen, deliberately and completely, to build their future together, secrets, scars, and all. The wedding took place that winter, beneath the same castle towers that had once echoed with fear and uncertainty, now filled instead with celebration and genuine joy, from a kingdom finally free of the shadow that had haunted its royal bloodline for centuries. Elena stood at Castian's side, as his wife and equal, the ancient power that had once threatened to consume him, now fully integrated as simply another part of who he was, controlled and understood, rather than feared and suppressed. Their story, which had begun with a single act of compassion toward a wounded stranger in a storm, had become something far greater than either of them could have imagined, proof that even the deepest curses and darkest secrets could ultimately be transformed into strength through the simple, powerful choice to love without fear.